2022, I was invited to speak at the national conference with SABR, and without exaggerating, that was a wonderful thrill, because you are my people. Like, this is what I would attend as a kid. My poor dad would drive me and sit in the corner and wondering what these Americans are doing, talking about this sort of stuff. So when I heard from Jana Marie, you're back in town, I know it's not so cool, but I sort of volunteered. Like, is there a time? Do you want me? Because like this, the SABR and especially the statistical analysis group are so important to me in my life. I'd argue there shouldn't be anybody else who appreciates you guys as much as I. When I was a kid, probably like many of you of my age, the Baseball Research Journal, statistical, updates, newsletters, and then some of the splinters from that, the Bill James books, the baseball scoreboards, the baseball analysts, all that sort of stuff, the Hidden Game of Baseball book, all of these things to a young man, to me anyway, was like magical. The idea that you could look through all these numbers, just this mess of numbers, and use some hard to understand statistical process, and then come up with knowledge, something that all of us had missed, the experts on the TV, the players themselves. To me, that was just this special, magical thing in life. I think it was like a little bit like treasure hunting. You were looking through this mess and uncovering something that others had missed, and sometimes it was right in front of you the entire time. And so SABR gave me that hobby, and I never had the imagination to think that it would ever be anything other than a hobby. There was nobody, as far as I knew, in baseball interested in this or working for that. But I think it was inevitable that what SABR created, the research that Dick Kramer or Pete Palmer or John Thorne or Bill James or Eric Walker or many others were like these sparks thrown out there. And it was inevitable that something was going to catch. Like what year or even what decade, like none of us knew where it was going to catch, none of us knew, but that it caught in the 80s with Sandy Alderson in Oakland was wonderful, but not a whole lot of people knew about that till 20 years later. Michael Lewis wrote a bestseller about it, and so that sort of ignited the spark that was created from you all, from SABR. And that's when I was able to turn this hobby into a job, into a career. I feel like I sort of outsmarted life, that I get to do this thing that was my hobby and I get to do it for a living, sort of like, take that, man, and that was all because of sort of being at the right place at the right time. Now I was single, I was able to divide my pay by 3 and move to St. Louis, to start this up, but that seemed like, I was from California, so it's hard to say moving to Missouri seemed like a blessing, but I guess it was in a little bit. And so for the few minutes with you, I'll share like some of these, I don't know if they're lessons, but some of these things that on this journey I was able to witness firsthand, because I had a unique experience as an analyst in baseball, in that all the owners I worked for, their marching orders weren't, hey, let's dip our toe into this analytics thing and see what there is with it. Instead, their marching orders were very clear. It's find out what innovations, what inefficiencies there are, and take advantage of them before the other guys do. And by the way, I'll be here to support the change, the pushback that inevitably is going to come with change. And so my first stopping point was in St. Louis. And a tiny bit of background on that. The owner, Bill DeWitt Jr., had read Moneyball, and he was sort of a hands-off but process paying attention to owner. And so he saw the decision-making processes that were going on at the time. And this was the St. Louis Cardinals. They were winning 100 games a year. And he had read Moneyball, and he sort of put those together and thought that it would be a good idea to improve this team that's already winning 100 games. So, I mean, kudos to him. That's, I think, a rare behavior in somebody that is continuously looking to improve and is looking to improve in a way where the players are outside of baseball. The source is going to be outside of baseball. So amazingly, he hired a McKinsey consultant. The GM, nobody wanted him, brought him in, and more amazingly, gave him responsibility of the draft. So we have scouts that work their entire lives getting promotions to one time be scouting director. So you can imagine the owner bringing in somebody who had no baseball experience. You know, he played fantasy baseball and he did well, but that was it. And giving him this responsibility. So you could imagine how incendiary that was. And I think that was the first thing I witnessed firsthand, is how our species often reacts to change, and especially unwanted change, that we do not hold our beliefs as if they are a work in progress, that this is something, as time goes on or as I get more information, I'm going to update and change. I think our beliefs are often held like prized possessions that we need to defend, we need to fight, we need to protect, and that's not the most, I think, flattering aspects of being a human being, because when we're defending ourselves, we often go into behaviors that maybe if we took a breath and stood back a little bit and looked at what we were doing, we would think twice. So I saw the treatment that this McKinsey consultant got. I saw the pushback that was going on. And I also saw an owner who was willing to support and put up with that pushback, to put up with the dysfunction that came with change. And to his credit, like we were able to have success because of the owner. Now, this was at a time when 26 of the 30 teams had 0 analysts. So it's often what I say, they thought 0 was the perfect number. Not too high, not too low. 0 is what we need. So whatever inefficiencies there were to find, it wasn't really much competition to find them. And then when you did find them, you weren't really sharing them with anybody. So you know the old joke of the two economists walking down the street, and one says, ah, that looks like a $20 bill. The other says, no, it can't be, because it would have already been picked up if it was a $20 bill. And so I remember coming to the Cardinals, and you could certainly see the predictive ability that scouts have. You look at an old baseball reference draft order before there were analysts in baseball, and sure enough, there's more major leaguers in the first round and second round and third round. So there is undoubtedly predictive ability in what a scout does. But similarly, you look at the back of a baseball card, and the guys who were good last year are often the guys who are good this year. All fantasy players know that. But what we didn't know at the time, and what your job sort of depended on, was after you have the scouts, did these numbers add much of anything? And I remember one of the first things I did when I got there was to do a retrospective study. So if all the teams were to draft using the combination of all the information, so that would be the scouts' expertise plus their college performance, how would you have done? And I remember doing this hoping that, you know, this better show that my salary is worth it. I better find something in this. And I remember the sick feeling, like imagining what happens if it's a flat line. How do I go to my bosses and say, you know, I quit my job, I moved to St. Louis, but look, you know, we're no value. And I remember simulating it and seeing the total results, and it was like 1.06, and I was like, oh man, 6% improvement. You know, it's better than nothing, but it's not much. And I remember, like, that didn't seem right. Like these teams were getting Kevin Youkilis and David Eckstein. There was a whole lot of good players that were being missed. And I looked more closely, and it wasn't 6%, it was 106%. That just using college level statistics would more than double the output of the draft. That's, I don't know, tens of millions of dollars every year. And I remember, okay, good. I do, as an outsider, have something to add. And so the magnitude of that, it's nearly impossible to find an inefficiency like that, that if you could believe it, teams were not using the evidence of who's good at baseball to judge who's going to be good at baseball. And while it doesn't tell the whole story, it undoubtedly tells a part of the story. And it tells a part of the story that often the experts who see the person miss. That certainly not everything that goes into baseball success could be seen by looking at a player run or looking at a player take some swings. There must be something more that might be invisible. And to the degree that it's invisible is the degree that the numbers will reveal that. And so that was an amazing inefficiency in the St. Louis days. And then after 7 years there, went to the Astros. And I remember the first lesson I learned was this like, oh shit moment. It was the belief that in the 7 years we were in St. Louis, not a whole lot of teams were joining in this, that the inefficiency was just getting like a haircut every year, but we were getting a little bit better. So in some imagination, like the inefficiency was still there and it would be around forever. But that's not the way the world works. If you look at an innovation adoption curve, it sort of starts on what looks like a flat line and then it explodes. And a couple of years into the Astros time, like a dozen teams were doing the same thing, and some were arguably doing it too much. So whatever inefficiency we had, like disappeared. And I remember thinking, oh God, you know, what's next? But it was about that time that TrackMan had come. So the radar device that measures the movement, horizontal, vertical movement, speed, of course, location of every pitch had just been made available. And so you had a good portion of 1 million pitches, and you had the result of those 1 million pitches. So again, it was sort of college level statistics to let's take these inputs and see how they predict the output. And so all of a sudden you had like an answer key to what is a good pitch in the major leagues. It's what every hitting coach or every pitching coach and pitcher wanted throughout the org. And I remember I think my lesson was there's certain times when a technology comes into an industry that you truly think of before and after. And when this technology came, it changed everything. It changed how you evaluate a pitcher, how you develop a pitcher, how you attack a hitter. It was everything. And so it wasn't a case of you know, old school versus new school. I describe it as akin to a telescope. I'm sure there were astronomers before there was a telescope, but once this device comes and it reveals something that your human senses can't, you can't say, you know, I'm old school, I'm good, I'm just gonna squint and make sense of those moons of Jupiter. Like, you have to adopt this. And a lot of persons didn't adopt it, that this was a change, this was sort of a change of their identity. You know, I'm a pitching coach, I see these things, I know these things. I've been training kids for years on these things. To admit that you may have been imperfect, wrong in some areas, was hard for a lot of persons. And I never would have guessed that, again, about our species, but I saw it firsthand. I saw how this was an opportunity for a lot of, they were young, but it wasn't because they were young, a lot of coaches who would attend conferences, who would read research, who were willing to rethink things, and how now baseball began to appreciate them and open up and give them opportunities too. And so it was a change in the skills needed. And I probably would not have guessed that that was again sort of the pushback to change. And then finally, after 7 years with the Astros, the opportunity with the Orioles came. And this was, I keep throwing 7 years, so this was 14 years after we were hired in the Cardinals, 17 years after the publication of Moneyball. And it's well known that the Orioles were able to avoid most every modern best practice there was in the baseball front office, that they were actively pushing back on this stuff. Now, of course, that might be a short-term fix, but it's not a long-term solution. And John Angelos had brought myself and Mike Elias, who we had worked together in the St. Louis days and in the Houston days, and had been through a lot of the change. I say, I saw the industry change. I was the 4th analyst in baseball. There's now close to 700, and probably before I'm done talking, another 1 or 2 will be hired. So we've seen the industry change, but it hasn't always been just like a front row seat. Sometimes we were in the middle of the stage of this drama of all the sometimes ugliness and defensiveness and closed-mindedness and lessons learned and behavioral changes that take place with something that could be considered a paradigm shift in baseball. And so we got the opportunity with the Orioles, and I remember appreciating man, the value of experience. So many of the things that the Orioles were struggling with were things that the Cardinals had struggled with or the Astros had struggled with, and that we in turn had struggled with how to solve that, and were imperfect in our attempts, but we learned what works. And I remember just this feeling of, okay, we've seen this before, we know what to do. And over here, we've seen this before, we know what to do. And so I think it may sound a little egotistical, but I think because of that experience and background we had, we were the right ones to bring in to take this organization from probably one of the least modern to one that I like to think is as modern as any. When I spoke last time, it was in 2022, so we were improving it was in fall of 22. Yeah, so 2023, won the American League East, won no playoff games, got swept. The following season, again in the playoffs, no playoff wins, and then last year was disappointing. So our work is very far from finished. All we could really control is the processes of all this. I don't know how to win, a best of 3 series. Even with the team like the Dodgers could put on the field, strange things happen. But I can assure you that the processes that we're making, the desire to improve, the insecurity we have of what might the Rays be doing, what are the Yankees doing, what are we missing, is alive and well in the Orioles front office. And I know I'm lucky. I'm lucky to have been involved in SABR as a kid. I'm lucky to have had that happen at a time when the industry was changing. And I'm glad I didn't have a career I couldn't leave and find out, first of all, find out where St. Louis was and then move there. And I'm also, I feel lucky that I'm able to return a tiny bit of it or see you guys. This reminds me of when I was that 12-year-old kid and my dad is driving me to Daly City for a SABR conference. So thank you very much for having me again. Thank you very much for all you've done. And I think we got some time before the next speaker for questions. And that's, I think,